Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Cash. I'm the Dean of the John W. McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Also speaking on behalf of my partner, Interim Dean Bob Chen, who's the Dean of the School for Environment here at University of Massachusetts, Boston. We have partnered with Steve Curwood and the team at Living on Earth on this series of the Living on Earth Book Club. We've now been doing this several years, and what a pleasure to be doing this today during our series of Earth Week events that are happening virtually at UMass Boston, but also in particular to be celebrating, exploring, and digging into a book by one of our own, Professor Maria Ivanova. She's a professor in our Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance in the McCormick Graduate School, and also the director of the Center for Governance and Sustainability, which she created. And she's also the director of our PhD program in Global Governance and Human Security. And she has written the definitive and path-breaking book on the United Nations Environment Program, its history, its hopes, its future. And I know that Steve will probably get into a little bit more about Maria's history, but I wanted to give a kind of more personal angle because when a faculty member here produces a book like this, it's years and years and years of effort and research and delving and interviews and communications with other humans who have their own hopes and dreams, who are trying to establish institutions that are bigger than themselves, that solve a problem that's bigger than themselves. And I've been fortunate enough to take 2 research trips with Professor Ivanova and her graduate students and her other faculty colleagues, once to Ethiopia and once to Rwanda. And here's what I think is remarkable about her, which I hope you see as you dive into the book and read the book. And that is, Professor Ivanova is particularly interested in the personal angle that people bring to these kinds of efforts. And I have seen her, it looks effortless, although I'm sure it's not, but I've seen her effortlessly talk to former presidents of Ethiopia, and I've seen her effortlessly talk with the drivers of our cars, with graduate students, with bureaucrats, which I think she would use that term in the most loving kind of way, with high-ranking officials, with every UNEP director there's ever been. And she does each with the kind of respect and grace and delving, not letting people off the hook, in a way that makes a true academic who ultimately can produce a book that will have the kind of impact that we think this book will. So it's a pleasure, Professor Ivanova, to be here on this remote stage with you. And now I want to hand it over to our colleague, Steve Curwood. He also has a posting at UMass Boston. It's been a pleasure working with Steve and his team, Jay and Jenny, over the years and pulling these events off. And Steve has done the remarkable thing over decades and decades of taking the complexities of environmental policy, of environmental impact, of environmental jobs in a way that makes it accessible and interesting and exciting. And I know for those of you who are here who listen to Living on Earth every week, you know that he doesn't just distill, he examines and explores and makes real this most complex and this most urgent series of issues that we face. So with that, let me hand it over to Steve, and I'll sit back and enjoy the show. Thanks so much, everybody.
Steve, you're muted.
This went to a default. Sorry. Okay, let's try once more here. David, thank you. So generous in that introduction. But you know what it takes to do a radio program like this is people like Maria. Because when Maria Ivanova comes on our air, man, she's like, boom. And we just lay back and enjoy it. And actually the painful part is that sometimes, you know, for the radio, you have to make things a little shorter. And she always has so much wonderful and incisive to say. So, and of course, I want to thank you, Dean Cash, and Dean Chen is not here today, and of course, the Center for Governance and Sustainability, as well as the UMass School for the Environment for sponsoring this event. But it's great. This feels a bit like homecoming, and in a time of our lives where we don't get to have things like homecoming so easily because of what's been going on with the pandemic, this is especially a joyful thing to have. So here it is. This is it. And the cool thing about this is that you didn't have to go to the airport in Nairobi, actually, to understand what's going on there, because Maria probably won't talk all that much about how she's traveled around the world, but it's not exactly like getting on the shuttle to Washington. Let me just leave it at that. And so you've done a terrific job here. But before we move forward here, I want to say, this is, of course, Earth Week. And this Living on Earth Book Club event is part of that we're sharing with the university. And so let's just take a nod for a moment to this planet, to this place that we call home. We can just really appreciate it, that it's here and we're with it today. All right, so let's move ahead. But before we have our conversation with Maria Ivanova, we're going to have some brief remarks from the one and the only Christiana Figueres. Christiana is a key architect of the Paris Climate Agreement. I mean, she worked tirelessly behind the scenes. People saw the results in 2015, but it took her, 6 years maybe, to really get all the parties to come together to do that. And as she was executive secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, otherwise known as UNFCCC. So we have some tape from her right now. So let's play that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christiana Figueres, and it is a true joy to introduce to you Professor Maria Ivanova, researcher, professor, mentor to so many young people, activist, and perhaps most important to me, longtime friend and colleague. In fact, I can't even remember how much of a long-time friend, but someone who has been very close to me personally and certainly to environmental issues for decades. Maria presents today her new book, The Untold Story of the World's Leading Environmental Institution, UNEP, at 50. Now, UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, is the top tier global environmental organization. Surprisingly, very little known outside of that community that deals with environmental issues. And it is surprising how little known it is given the outsized role that it plays in planetary well-being, but also in the nexus between planetary well-being and human well-being. Second to none, Maria, after years of research and countless interviews, Maria takes us through the challenging history of the creation of UNEP and then its trajectory over the first 50 years, both as the leading voice and convener of decision makers in the sector, but also as a remarkable example of the difficulties of global governance, exemplifying why it is so critical to invest into global governance, especially in a world that is moving more and more into global interconnectivity. And that we must do despite the complex challenges that come with it. Maria's book is a huge contribution to environmental history, but also to our current thinking on the future of global governance. As I say, in a world that is increasingly global oriented and globally interconnected. I cannot think of a better platform for Maria to be in conversation about her new book than Living on Earth, and especially to be in conversation with my other good friend, the one and only Steve Curwood. How exciting to have them both here discussing issues that are so much at the core of the quality of life, of all life on this planet for the next 50 years. Please enjoy.
Oh, thank you, Christiana, for your kind words and your enduring global optimism. You've been such a powerhouse in this process. And I think it's fair to say that the Paris that we know, the Paris that President Biden came back to, the Paris that John Kerry is working right now so hard to try to keep moving forward, would not have been possible without you and your optimism and clarity. So thank you so much. Now, of course, we're really grateful to have Maria Ivanova, UNEP's biographer, the unofficial UNEP historian, join us to talk about the future of the United Nations Environment Program, otherwise known as the World's Environmental Conscience, as it turns 50. And of course, we know what happened 50 years ago. We saw the world come together around the concept of Earth Day and the fact that we needed to do something. And UNEP was born out of that ethos. So, and I also want to thank everyone for joining us today. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom now to submit your questions. Or if you're on Facebook Live, please comment with your question. With no further ado, Maria Ivanova, welcome to Living on Earth.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for having me on this fantastic program.
Our pleasure. So, Maria, as Christiana Figueres mentioned, the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP, well, it's not exactly the most best-known institution on the planet. Why is the world's leading environmental institution so obscure, do you think?
Well, first of all, it is indeed Earth Day week that we're celebrating, and it is important to think back at how this Earth Day was born, who were the actors at that time, what have been the repercussions. And I have argued, Steve, that UNEP's creation was indeed a function of this country, the United States, taking leadership as a result of Earth Day 50 years ago, when 20% of the population of this country spilled into the streets and demanded different response from its government. And it led to the creation of the institutions that we know in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency, the various laws, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. And then this country went to the international community and argued that we can't solve the problems alone. And for that, we need an international institution. That's how UNEP was born. And yet, as you say, 50 years on, not everybody knows about it, while perhaps everybody should. So why don't we know about it? And I can't say that that has always been the case. It has been different. We are asking today, why is it obscure? Today, why don't we know about it? And we, who? We in the United States, we in the global public, Governments know about it. Developing countries know about it. They go to UNEP, they ask for its support, for its function in that collective action on global environmental issues. And so there are various theories, one of which is UNEP has been more successful than we think. We don't know about it because it has been doing so much work, but it hasn't demanded recognition. And we'll talk later today, and it is spelled out in the book, the various issues that UNEP did put on the global agenda. And not only in terms of which problems have been resolved, but also which problems have become known to the world and how it has stood up for various countries. So it has been working, it has done a lot of good. Maybe we have not seen the recognition that it deserves. But also, perhaps we should think of which international institutions are known, right? We hear the World Bank, IMF. Why do we know about them? Because they're controversial. Because we hear the arguments against them about not necessarily all the positive impacts that they're doing. And UNEP has not been in that sphere, has not been that controversial. But maybe also because the governments that have given a lot of, that have given funding have not really put it as the priority. So the United States has not really propelled UNEP's visibility forward. So why is that the case? And then finally, possibly also because its story has not been told. In a sense, this is what pushed me to write this book. And as you see, the title is The Untold Story of UNEP. And why I even started writing is because as a student of global environmental governance, I saw books about all of the international institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Health Organization, but there was no academic book about UNEP. And so in colleges and universities, we don't have a book about that international institution. And so maybe its story has not been told in terms of not only books, but also the op-eds and the news media. I think now, as it's turning 50, it's time to change that. And it's time to bring out the untold stories of this organization and of others who have done a lot of great work on the environmental sphere, but also what else needs to be done.
Well, that's right, Maria. To what extent, though, has UNEP been hiding its light under a bushel? And what I'm thinking about actually is geography. I was kidding you as we began about the airport in Nairobi, but connectivity there is different from other parts of the planet. And so many of those active organizations that you mentioned, or highly recognized organizations, are in Geneva or they're in New York. And typically for international diplomacy, the world does not go to Nairobi. What impact do you think that has had?
So the connectivity is a really important issue. Look at where we are now. Look what we're doing. Without connectivity, we could have none of this discussion. We have been grounded. The entire world has been grounded for a year, and yet we're perhaps most connected than ever because of this ability. But if we think about it, Steve, this is recent. So you're right. When UNEP was established in Nairobi, the first international organization to be headquartered in a developing country, and still one of only two, the other one being UN Habitat, which remains, both of these are headquartered in Nairobi. This was this was radical. It was very radical in 1972 to create an international institution in a developing country. You're absolutely right. Most of these institutions were created in Geneva, in New York, some in Washington, D.C., in the developed world. And the proposal by Kenya in 1972 to host the first headquarters of an international body, of a UN body, and happened to be the environmental body in a developing country, was absolutely radical. And I have dived into the archives at the United Nations and figured out what happened. How did countries agree? What were the debates? It was a very contentious debate, by the way. It wasn't easy. And surprisingly, when I was looking at the transcripts of those debates, it was developing countries who said, listen, we don't have missions in Nairobi. We have missions in Geneva. It will be easier for us to argue in Geneva for our interests. But since this is a political decision, and Kenya made it clearly a political decision, we will vote with our political bloc, which was the G77 in China at the time. And so I argue in the book that the location in Nairobi has had an impact on UNEP, a profound impact on the organization, but also the organization has had a profound impact on its host community, on its host country. And connectivity indeed has been a challenge, but it has also been the impetus behind Kenya developing its technological might. And Kenya now is one of the hubs in Africa of connectivity, of high-tech development. And it is attracting a lot more, not only organizations, but also a lot more people who want to work there and who are having an impact on the tech industry in Nairobi and in Kenya. So yes, there has been an impact. That's undeniable, but I think the political gesture is very important. And the argument that Kenya made in 1972 still stands. We do need the United Nations to have more headquarters of more organizations around the world. But how to make that function is the story that I think we need to learn from UNEP's experience.
Yes, and maybe some other UN organizations, international organizations, might take advantage of Nairobi now that the way has been made there. And of course, you noted in your book that Wangari Maathai, being from Kenya, really was able to leverage the presence of UNEP for the work that was recognized, of course, by the Nobel Peace Prize. But so things are getting better, and hopefully the connectivity issue will get even better, and more organizations, not less, will find their way there. So now I know that you said that you looked around and nobody had written about the United Nations Environment Program, but what got you curious about it? Why you? Why Professor Maria Ivanova?
Oh, I started this, Steve, long before I was professor, long before that even crossed my mind to be in academia, when I was on the other side on the academic table, when I was a student myself. And I think, I mean, you know that I came to the United States as an international student myself, and part of the first group of Bulgarians who came to this country for an education against the odds, against all odds. I came to Massachusetts, to Mount Holyoke College in 1992, when everybody thought it was impossible, because who would, one, accept you, and two, support you financially to pursue your education in the United States. And so Mount Holyoke did.
Except they didn't know Maria Ivanova, and Mount Holyoke, when they met her, said, "Oh, we got to have this woman. What do we have to do?"
And talk about connectivity. There was no internet at the time. We had to go to the embassy in Sofia and look at the Peterson Guide of Colleges, and the only criterion was financial aid available to foreign students. But so this also speaks to the acumen of leadership in higher education, because Mount Holyoke did take a risk and accepted not just me, several Bulgarians and several Eastern Europeans and others who could not afford to pursue an education here, and has continued to do so. And perhaps this played a very important role of me becoming a professor myself. But it was in that setting, Steve, that I started pursuing international environmental issues. And as part of the 5-college system in Western Massachusetts, we could take classes at UMass Amherst. So in a sense, I've come full circle when I took a class at UMass Amherst in the spring of 1993 on Scandinavian government and politics, where Professor Einhorn talked about environmental policy in Scandinavia. And it dawned on me that this is something I'd like to pursue. So I've actually had a very straightforward path and have tried to figure out how and why do countries come together to solve environmental issues. And that's how UNEP came into focus as the institution whose mandate it was to facilitate that. And so I've stayed on that track since.
Talk to me, there's so much in your book, but let's talk about some of the successes that UNEP has had. Perhaps we could talk about a few of those. I'm thinking of everything from the oceans to ozone and the time of Mustafa Talba. But perhaps you have other stories that you'd rather tell, but those two come to mind for me.
Yes, so UNEP did begin with a vision of how do we bring countries together to solve these problems that no one country can solve by themselves. And so marine policy is one of the issues that was first on the agenda, and that was the Mediterranean Action Plan. And so if you imagine the Mediterranean, the late 1960s, early 70s, a lot of countries with very different agendas who are basically polluting the sea by just doing their normal economic activities, but all of the outputs or outflow going into the sea. And if you imagine the Mediterranean, and its water does not turn around very easily. And so you see, those were, in a sense, what Bill Ruckelshaus, the first administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency here in the United States, said those were smell, feel, and touch environmental problems. That's what galvanized the community here in the United States on environmental issues, and there were similar movements around the world. And so UNEP seized the issues around the Mediterranean on marine policies and brought countries together. And so when you have Israel and Palestine and Egypt and France and Italy and Greece and Turkey sit around the same table and have a conversation about a common natural resource that they share and how to work to resolve these issues, it was radical. So UNEP was successful in bringing those countries together, in articulating the issues and figuring out the policies that were to be implemented in all of these countries. So that is a clear success. And it's often referred to as the crown jewel, the Mediterranean Action Plan. And then UNEP tried to repeat this in other issues. And you're absolutely right. Ozone is perhaps the only global environmental issues that we have resolved. So all of us who teach global environmental governance usually say, ozone, here is the paramount success in global environmental governance. And the reasons that we often give as scholars are the institutions and the fact that the United States had a business, DuPont, that came to figure out substitutes, and it pushed for an agreement. The various mechanisms that were created. But what I tell in the book in some detail was the importance of the leadership of UNEP as an institution and of its director at the time, Mustafa Talba, as the individual.
Yeah, what was his secret sauce? What was Mustafa Talba's secret sauce? And you might start by talking about a little bit of his history, where he was from, because as you mentioned,
yes.
In particular, back in the Mediterranean story, it's not exactly the, it's not free of contention, to put it mildly.
Nothing is free of contention, indeed. And it is exactly in those contentious stories or contentious accounts that we discover the truth, and we discover what happened and what matters in international politics. So Mustafa Toba was the executive director of UNEP from 1976 to 1993. The longest serving executive director, 17 years. But he was also the deputy executive director when UNEP was being created. So he was the deputy to Morris Strong, the first executive director. So Mustafa Toba indeed had been with UNEP from day one, or maybe even day zero, because he represented Egypt as the delegate of Egypt to the first global conference on the human environment, the Stockholm Conference of 1972. And he was a scientist. And I'll never forget when in my interviews with him, when he would tell the story of how he had a turnaround, he had a come around moment, because he said that he went to Stockholm fully convinced that the environment was a ruse from the developed North to keep the South from development. And he said, look, in the Egyptian pound, we have a smokestack. That is the symbol of industrialization, of progress. It's pollution. And yet he said that Morris Strong and the whole Stockholm Conference really did lead him to come around and see that the environment was the foundation. And so Morris Strong became the first executive director, Toba the deputy, and then when Morris Strong left, he became the executive director. And indeed, the secret sauce was complex. It was a mixture. It was a mixture of his leadership style, leadership approach, leadership type. He was an intellectual, he was a scientist, but he taught himself diplomacy, he taught himself economics. He also was not afraid of taking leadership and taking responsibility. And perhaps most obviously, he himself said, I was a head basher. So.
And Maurice Strong wasn't?
Maybe not in that way. That's a good, not in the same way. And also he had only just a few years.
Right.
He was at UNEP just for a couple of years. But what Mustafa Toba did is when he brought governments, and there are multiple accounts of his leadership style, and people would say that he would push countries to agree until the last moment. And this is perhaps why we have the Montreal Protocol why we have resolved the ozone issue, because Mustafa Toba did not give up. And he brought governments together. And in the book, I also talk about subsequently how UNEP resolved or came to pass the various conventions on chemicals, again by Mustafa Toba, working with governments and playing his tricks on governments. And he was in the hospital when the Basel Convention on the transboundary movement of hazardous waste was being negotiated. And one of my interviewees said he came out of the hospital, he put his trousers, his pants on top of his pajamas, and he pulled his pajama pants down and went to the conference room saying to governments, you better come to a conclusion now. I'm in the hospital. And this is really important. And so he knew how to work the room, but most importantly, he identified himself with the institution. And he also said very clearly, it is my responsibility to push what needs to be done. I know what needs to be done. As a scientist, I have that responsibility.
So, of course, you chronicle successes, and then there have been some things that haven't been quite as successful. And one of those things that I guess was problematic for Mustafa Tolba was the 1992 Rio World Summit on the Environment. And you write that he kind of pulled UNEP back because he didn't feel that he had the appropriate role there. Tell us a bit of that story. What happened, and what do you think ultimately the consequence was from Rio as a result of UNEP being not as intensely engaged as it might have been?
So in our various textbooks on global environmental governance, we often see the beginning of global environmental governance is 1972, when we had the Stockholm Conference, the Stockholm Declaration, and the creation of UNEP. And then a great success was 1992, 20 years later, with the Rio Earth Summit, that we often celebrate as the greatest success in global environmental governance. And so in my book, I tell a bit of a different story, indeed, because people that I spoke with came forth and said, yes, especially the people at UNEP, we see Rio often as a success, but for UNEP, it was not. And why is that? And that goes back to your connectivity issue, Steve, that in the first 2 decades of UNEP's operation, connectivity was not that developed, right? It wasn't as easy to speak with governments or with the other institutions in Geneva or other places. And so Maurice Strong was the head of, or was the executive secretary of the Rio conference, 1992. And I also tell in the book why and how that came about, which I figured out only through an interview with Maurice Strong and his relationship with Javier Perez de Cuellar, who would then become the Secretary General of the United Nations and would make Maurice Strong the Secretary General of that conference. Indeed, Mustafa Tolba expected to be the leader, the Secretary General of the Rio conference, because UNEP was indeed the leading environmental institution, but he was not. And so there are layers upon layers of untold stories there, and I do not claim to have them all, but I do tell some of them in the book. And indeed, the lack of communication led to somewhat of a misunderstanding of UNEP and what its role would be. And again, one of the issues is this competition among UN agencies. That in 1972, there were a lot of UN agencies with responsibility for environment. In 92, there were even more. And so for UNEP to be telling them what to do when the connectivity wasn't as smooth or as easy as it is today, and it was not present in their midst, it was difficult. And so UNEP had become a competitor to these other agencies, and sustainable development took over the environment agenda and the environment narrative. And I mean, I hope also the listeners remember the pillars, the 3 pillars of sustainable development: environment, economy, and social issues. And then when we talk about integration, pillars do not integrate. And so we separated these issues and we separated the environment out, and UNEP lost in that process.
And of course, UNEP's involvement, or the force of UNEP then in what moved forward, especially with the UNFCCC, which gets essentially created there in the Rio process, with Maurice Strong at the helm come Kyoto, for example, makes it tougher even for UNEP to be recognized, to be a player in this. But Mustafa Tolba hung in there for quite a while, and he didn't really move on until the early 90s, when Elizabeth Doswell took over. And how fair is it to say that she had, well, let's call it a different managerial style, a different approach to things?
She did, as did all of UNEP executive directors. I think that's the beauty of looking into an institution through the eyes of the individuals, both the individuals that led it, but also the individuals that worked within the organization. And they all bring their particular backgrounds, their education, their gender. Indeed, Lisbeth Dowdeswell was the first woman executive director of UNEP. That was 1993. I mean,
Right. And how
today
about,
we see that.
I'm sorry, and how about, yeah,
Yeah.
and how about operating in East Africa as a woman running an agency on top of that?
It was challenging. It was challenging. And I do speak about this in the book, that she did encounter obvious issues of sexism. And today, it's easier for us to talk about these issues, though we haven't resolved them yet. Whether they're issues of sexism, of racism, of marginalization. And so when you have a new executive director, indeed, you look at them, you see who they are. They bring those elements to their style, to their management style, but also the organization looks at them and thinks, oh, they saw a woman first, and they saw a Canadian woman first, and so she experienced quite a bit of pushback from within, from outside, but also let's not forget the time in history within which each of these directors operated. And in the book, I talk about the individual, but I also talk about the geopolitical reality within which they operated. And so Liz Dowdeswell was there in the early 1990s. I mean, this was neoliberalism running amok, right? We prioritized economic growth above all else. And I mean, having lived through the end of the Cold War myself at that time, and the expectation of a green dividend, and seeing that no, it did not materialize. And so the United States turned very differently from the 1970s. So every executive director needs to be analyzed in that particular point in time, and also what they bring as an individual, as a professional, what is their history, what is their approach. And so Elizabeth Dowdeswell came with a vision of UNEP as bringing people together to resolve global environmental problems, and with a Canadian type approach of consensus building. But she inherited an organization that had been run differently. And so she had hurdles to overcome.
Yeah, you joke that Mustafa Tobla maybe had a pharaonic, or was the pharaoh type of approach, that he was the boss. But say a little bit more about the circumstances for a moment, and what it would ultimately mean for UNEP. So you have UNEP not running the Rio conference in 1992, and Tolba very disappointed, and in fact, essentially decides, okay, I'm out of here. Liz Dowdeswell comes from Canada, where Maurice Strong was from, and coming into an organization where, frankly, there's a lot of tension about what the central UN folks are doing and how they're handling UNEP. Not to mention other issues, like you said, what the development program, what UNDP was doing, and I think at the time they had a $2 billion budget or something, and to be blunt, in your view, how do you think UNEP was able to come through this and to survive and thrive as well as it has, given all those cards that were being played against it?
It's interesting you would mention the United Nations Development Program. You say a $2 billion budget, it's probably $4 billion budget now. And what is what's very fascinating now that the former executive director of UNEP, Achim Steiner, is now the administrator, which is the UNDP term for executive director of the UN Development Program, of UNDP. And so maybe that will give us a different setup and see if environment and development will work much closer together. But you're right. The cards were stacked in a certain way. It was very difficult for a very small UN body, as some colleagues write, tucked away in Nairobi, to have the impact that it was envisioned to have. And in the book, I talk about the original vision, that the vision for UNEP was indeed to serve as the connector of the various UN agencies and the organization, the institution that could see the 3,000-piece puzzle from 30,000 feet up. And that was difficult because you did have these competing interests, and they did manifest in Nairobi, but also because, Steve, UNEP was successful. Mm-hmm. And it was successful in naming the issues, bringing the science to the fore, of saying we need to collaborate and create certain policies and instruments and structures. The conventions, or as we also know them, multilateral environmental agreements. And then it also argued for, sometimes more successfully than others, for support for the countries that needed to establish these necessary institutions to implement the global agreements. And that has been UNEP's core ever since. And I think that now, with connectivity, that has improved. Also of us seeing how important the environment is to basically every aspect of human life. I do think at its 50th now, UNEP has a real chance of reinventing itself, of reimagining itself, of reconfiguring itself to being the institution that it was designed to be.
Let us all hope. We certainly need it, swinging into action. So let's talk about the United States. I mean, U.S. very much involved with getting UNEP, with getting it going, but really, I think this nation has really backed off. And I think that's frankly been a bipartisan agreement to do so. I don't know that you can point the figure more at the Democrats than the Republicans along these lines. What's to be done? Why do you think that happened, and what's to be done?
It's a difficult question. And I think you really are asking exactly what needs to be asked. Why is that? And I think everyone who's answering will have their own story. And that's probably a book in itself. What
there you go, another one.
Exactly. I mean, explaining the United States to me is really a project that I've been interested in for years and would love to pursue. And indeed, by talking to the people who were the United States. Because in international relations, we often say the United States or France or Canada. And yet there is no such thing as the United States. There is not one statement or one policy. It has changed over time. And so in a sense, you're getting at this evolution of the United States through your question about its role in UNEP, but also in global environmental governance more broadly. And so that has fascinated me, Steve, because when I looked into the archives and when I went into the living rooms and the kitchens of the people who were the United States in 1970, as this country was preparing for the first environment conference, I discovered a story that I hadn't read about, that this country wanted to create a functioning institution, or the government at the time. And mind you, it was Richard Nixon's who was president. But then I talked to John MacDonald, and you see the foreword of the book is by Ambassador John MacDonald, who was in the international organizations unit. He led that at the State Department at the time. And he talked about, I did not want to create a weak institution. Here are the resolutions I drafted. And these are the issues that we discussed. And here's what the president said. But then what happened with the United States afterwards is you see these changes in administrations, you see the changes in the overall context with economic development taking precedence over environmental issues, with economic growth being prioritized over everything. And I think that the cultural narrative at the time, and this is where universities are also very, very important. We shape the narratives. And this is how the United States narrative has been influenced, has been shaped. And I think we carry a certain responsibility now as we're changing the narrative. And you started with Christiana Figueres and pointing out that we have Paris and a successful Paris Agreement because she was there, because she managed to change the narrative. And so I think this is a fantastic research project of following the US narrative on environment over time and figuring out why that happened.
Indeed, we play such an outsized role on the world stage, more so perhaps back then than we do today, although we're not in a small position right now. And how we move forward from here, I think, is going to be very important for the future of the planet, and how we support and strengthen an institution like UNEP and take advantage of the convening and understanding powers of this will make a difference for the planet, will make a difference. But as you know, in the United States, we don't like to be told anything. And so to have Nairobi say to Washington, well, what about this? We need a change in our culture. We need
That's
a
right.
change in our culture.
Actually, Steve,
Let's see. Yes.
Just on that point, in the 1992 summit, and I saw someone in the questions and answers said 92 was the Earth Summit when I came to study in the US. It's like, that is so true. And that is when President Bush said the American lifestyle is not up for negotiation.
That's right. Yep. And
but we
and
have to negotiate.
Yeah.
How we have to renegotiate with ourselves and then with others how we live and what is our impact on this planet.
You know, and this is not in your book, but the renegotiation is actually happening inside this country as well, because all that push for the economic growth, the neo-liberal approach, well, if you look at the math, only what, 1/10% of Americans have seen higher income. The rest are flat or even declined in real earnings. So even this goal of, well, let's just go for broke for money and not take care of the environment has not yielded the money. And maybe this country might be open to a more fulsome dialogue about what we really should do, which means, of course, that one of the things we need to do is to be sure that UNEP is strong. I'm looking here for my producers to see about questions, because we're coming up on time here. Jay Feinstein is our producer here. Is there anything you want to put? Oh, here comes a question now. Steve Charnovitz is asking, given the important U.S. role in promoting the establishment in UNEP, how could the U.S. upgrade its support? This is a practical question about what we're just talking about. For example, should there be a United States ambassador to the United Nations Environment Program the way that we have somebody representing us at the World Trade Organization? Thanks.
Excellent question, and thank you, Steve, for that. I have to say, this is the beauty of academia. I used to take classes with Steve Charnowitz at Yale. He was always working on trade and environment, very insightful. And the United States has to rethink its engagement in global environmental governance, and to start with UNEP indeed is the right place to start. So a couple of things. One is indeed having an ambassador represent us at that level will be very, very important. And the other part is, as we say, putting your money where your mouth is. This country created the organization and funded 40% of UNEP. Also, the United States in 1992 and 1993 contributed $22 million to UNEP on an annual basis. In 1994, when we have the Gingrich Revolution, it dropped to 8 and then to 6 million. So the United States now contributes a mere 6 million to the Environment Fund of UNEP. That is unconscionable. And so I think the United States needs to re-engage. It needs to send its ambassadors. It needs to negotiate. It needs to put issues on the table and then act on them domestically. But also the United States needs to contribute financially to this international institution.
All right, let me see if we have another question that, Jenny, perhaps you could roll in the video that the Kenyan environmental journalist, Joe Aregno, did for us. Oh, here he is.
All right, thank you very much. It really is good to be part of this discussion. I have been privileged to walk with Maria through this journey all the way from her days at Yale, and that's many years ago, and to see this whole almost a lifetime of fantastic effort immortalized in form of a book. I think that really is fantastic. I think the book, which I would say I've been privileged to see come to life, having been part of some of the more consequential developments, such as the meeting that happened in Clion in the summer of 2009, where a lot of perspectives that have formed important chapters of this book actually came from. I really feel privileged to be part of this. But I think the book has brought out interesting perspectives. Certainly, as someone who comes from Kenya, it's interesting to read through the pages of the book how Maria deals with the question, for example, of the design, the original design of UNEP. Was it meant to be weak and ineffective? And she demonstrates with a lot of evidence that this was actually not the case. I think what I would like to ask at this stage, perhaps, where does Maria see this whole question of environmental governance and the environmental movement generally going in light of COVID, which has changed a lot of perspectives? Does she think that COVID is likely to accelerate or in fact lead to a retrogression in terms of how people look at the environment? Some people think people have become a little bit more inward looking. That kind of militates against the idea of multilateralism in dealing with something that is actually multinational as the environment. I would like to really hear perspectives as we go into the next 50 years of UNEP.
And Joe Ageyo, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced his name. He's tossed a question to you. And what do you say?
Yes, this is a time of reflection, of introspection, of what has this new reality done, and indeed, how is our world changing? And I think it's at the core of how we started this conversation, Steve, which brings us full circle, and it is about connectivity. I think the current pandemic and this COVID situation has led to a realization that we are as strong or as weak as the weakest amongst us. And on the one hand, yes, indeed, it has spurred national and nationalistic responses. And on the other hand, it has really showed our interdependence as societies and as one society, this one Earth. But secondly, it has also led to a democratization of engagement. Through this connectivity, we have changed the way we communicate, we have changed the way we transmit our messages, and the way we teach. So I hope that we take the positive parts of this situation and that UNEP learns how to move forward. Indeed, one of my main recommendations that were written way before the current situation was for UNEP to use the online connectivity more. And it began to do so in this latest UN Environment Assembly that happened just a couple of months ago.
Yes, UNEP has the power to convene, and with the electrons doing all the convening for us these days, suddenly Nairobi isn't so far away as long as the circuits are up. So, oh, we are all out of time. Time flies when you're having a good time, and we're going to have to wrap it up here. So let me just say that Maria Ivanova is the author of the Untold Story of the World's Leading Environmental Institution, UNEP at 50. And this is the book published by MIT Press that you can get if you want to get this in depth, all 300 pages of it, to understand both the history of the institution, but also I think, Maria, it's one of the best things that you did here was to just give us a snapshot of this moment of time, just what's going on, that we started a process that was really doing well to deal with the crisis, and somehow we've kind of gotten stuck as the crisis continues. And so, yes, it's a case study of how we both did well and then we didn't do so well. But it's also a call to action to say that we've got to get unstuck. This is not exactly, this is not an option. This is not an option to continue to just kind of bump along with low budgets and low attention and everything. And to have the UN have its, did you say 30,000 agencies or 30,000 feet? I forget, 3,000 agencies and 30,000 feet. Because we've got to come together on this. We have no choice. And for that, I too am grateful in a weird way for the virus, because it reminds us that it is one planet. It doesn't matter really how wealthy you are, that you can't escape something like this, because it will affect you and your household. Yes, maybe you can be behind some big wall or something, but now you're locked behind a big wall. And so hopefully we'll be able to move forward from this thing that it ain't over yet, is it? It's getting better, but it's not over yet. And in the developing world, it's really not over yet. So hopefully we will take the opportunity to catalyze this, because the pandemic will be over at some point. But if we don't get these huge environmental issues, and I'm thinking especially of climate, but there are others, there's no redo. There's no taking it over again. This is our shot, so we need to take it. Maria Ivanova is the author of The Untold Story of the World's Leading Environmental Institution, UNEP at 50. So thank you for joining us today, Maria. Excuse me, I should say Professor. Excuse me.
No.
No. And I want to thank our co-sponsors here. We have the John W. McCormick Graduate School, UMass Boston School for the Environment. Yes, there's our dean for the John W. McCormick School. And of course, your Center for Governance and Sustainability. And I want to thank everyone who's here online with us for joining us. Now, if you did enjoy this event, please consider supporting what we do at Living on Earth by donating at our website. It's loe.org. UNEP is about to celebrate a big anniversary, and so are we, because for the past 30 years, we have offered listeners the latest coverage of climate change, ecology, human health, and human interest stories every week. So this is the perfect opportunity to help us offer listeners, to continue to help offering to listeners accurate, engaging, and the in-depth reports that the crew that works with me puts together, the science and the policies, understanding the environment. And of course, we will be making a broadcast of what we've done here with Maria today, and it'll also be on our podcast in the Living on Earth book club. So if you want to help out, this is a great time. We are listener supported, and your contribution does make an impact, whether you donate $5 or $500, or if you want to send us $5,000, we'll take it. We won't take the 5 million because I think maybe the UNEP needs it. If they're down to 6 million a year, they probably need it more than we could use it. But really, every little bit helps. So be sure to sign up for our newsletter at loe.org as well to find out about the great events that we're having in the upcoming months. So again, thank you all for joining us. Have a happy Earth Day, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Truly an honor.